Great. And I updated the stream title before I started, kind of. I'm really proud of myself for doing that. And by before I started, I mean I started the stream, realized I hadn't fixed it, and then I started the stream up again. But I'm just going to sit here and chat to myself until I see somebody else in the chat. I have gotten surprisingly good at just talking into the void. It's fun. It's a good time just chatting. Hey, there's somebody that I can talk to. Howdy, Kelrilo. Good to see you again. Kevin Blaze, nice to see you. I cannot interpret those hieroglyphics. Wolfstrider, nice to meet you. Nice to see a new face around here. I'm just going to hang out for a couple minutes as folks get in, give folks a chance to show up into the stream, get themselves situated, and then we'll go ahead and get things kicked into gear. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, whether they be about the lesson that was posted earlier today, any of the previous lessons, about the Judge program in general, or anything else really. I'm just hanging out here. Magic Player for Life, good afternoon to you as well. I've got a question about your name. So it says Magic Player for Life, but it doesn't... You're playing Star Wars Unlimited now, so you gonna do both? Oh, nice. Nice to see that, Wolfstrider. Phantom Physics, you got a gavel ready? I'm really excited. I really actually am excited about Andor because there's a representation of a judge in like the Star Wars universe, and we don't see that a whole ton. Ooh, we got a question right out the gate from Kel Rilo. Does Force Lightning stop the Foundling upgrade? I'm pretty sure it doesn't. I just want to double check what Foundling says. But no, yeah. So the attach unit gains the Mandalorian trait. Force Lightning gets rid of abilities, but doesn't get rid of traits, and so Force Lightning will not stop the Foundling. Oh, nice. Lorcana and Magic, yeah, that's reasonable. Somewhere around here. I should really have it on display. I have the old Star Wars Decipher TCG somewhere in a box in here. But that's not what I'm here for. Oh, nice. Collecting Pokemon too. I have a deck somewhere in here. There's a lot of stuff in here. I'm glad to see a bunch of people who are coming to Star Wars Unlimited from other TCGs, but I'm also really excited to see the huge number of folks who are coming in and this is their first TCG. But, oh gosh, Cradle at $10, that is, oh boy, that's like getting a Vader for like 10 cents. I don't think that's even the appropriate ratio. I think it's even better than that. But let's dive into today's lesson, unless anybody has any questions before we get started. Otherwise, we're going to talk about zones and rounds. Some very thrilling stuff today. Alrighty. So, what are the zones? Which ones are public? Which ones are hidden? Which ones are shared? And which ones are personal? What are the phases of the turn and the steps within them? All that sort of thing. So, the 7 zones are the base zone, resource zone, deck, hand, discard, ground arena, and space arena. It feels very... This is a tangent. But it feels very weird to me. Like, the base zone, resource zone, those make sense as zones. But calling the deck zone is something that I recoil at. And, like, the ground arena zone is, oh boy, a bit of a mouthful. So just abbreviating these to base, resource, deck, hand, discard, ground, and space, probably good enough. Now, as I was mentioning, some of these are shared and some of them are personal. BGD, there is no draw zone. Cards are in the deck until they are drawn, and then they are in the hand. Similarly, if a card is being discarded from the deck, it's in the deck until it's discarded, and then it is immediately in the discard pile. There's no intervening space. The shared zones are the base, resource, deck, hand, and discard zone. These zones are or sorry, those are personal zones. I can't remember what I said. My brain's all over the place. Those are personal zones. You have your own. Your opponent has their own. Stuff that happens in one of them only affects that personal zone, whereas something that applies to the ground arena applies to all units in that ground arena. Same with the space arena. Public zones or open zones include base, ground and space arena, discard, and kind of resource. The identities of the cards, not really resource. Why did I say that? That's just wrong. The contents of the cards in the resource hand and deck zones are hidden from at least one player, and so they're generally hidden zones, whereas the base zone, discard, ground arena, and space arena, all of those cards are face up and public knowledge. One thing that does happen in the ground arena and the space arena is if a card or if a unit is captured, it is placed face down under the capturing unit. However, even though it's face down, the identity of that card and all of its attributes are still open information. So even though that card is not visible, players are allowed to look at that and get that information. The steps and phases of the turn, and we'll get to these later on in the lesson. We got 2 whole phases. We have the action phase, in which players take actions, and the regroup phase, in which the game takes care of itself. Both phases have a start of phase and end of phase step, and in the action phase we have player turns. During the regroup phase we have 3 distinct steps, which are the draw step, the resource step, and the ready step. These are named after the things that players do during those rounds and are pretty straightforward. Bushwookie Gaming asks, can someone look at their face down resources anytime now with Smuggle, or do you just have to remember what you put there? You have always been able to look at your resources at any time. Even before Smuggle was a thing, you were able to look at them. This is something that a lot of Han Solo Audacious Smuggler players did from set 1, because they were choosing which resource to defeat. And they were looking at it and be like, okay, this is the one that I want to defeat because I want it in my discard now so I can do some shenanigans with that sort of thing. There's going to be, I believe, a rules clarification coming down the line that you are also allowed to reorder your resources at any time, even in response to an opponent playing a card or resolving an ability. As long as you maintain which resources are exhausted and which ones are not. Wolfstrider asks, if a card is removed from the game due to an extra card being drawn and the opponent picks one to remove, would that create a new zone? No. So in policy currently, if a player draws an extra card, they have too many cards in their hand for whatever reason. Cards that are... the opponent picks an excess card, that card is set aside. Set aside is not considered a game zone. It is where tokens live as well. Any experience tokens and shield tokens, and in the future battle droids and clones, begin the game set aside, and they are not part of the game. They're not part of the play area. And so cards that are set aside due to judge actions are not part of the game. It's possible that this becomes an interactable zone. I know other games, Magic, that area did not start as an interactable zone. It was just removed from the game, and then became a very interactable zone. I really like Phantom Physics' suggestion of calling it the Outer Rim. That's kind of hilarious. Maybe the Unknown Regions. We got a lot of options here of place where we don't know a whole lot of stuff. Extra galactic. We got options. In any case, set aside is separate from being in the game, and it's just wholly inaccessible by the game, at least for now. Alrighty. To the zones themselves. The base zone. Each player has their own base zone. It begins with the base in it. It also begins with the leader in it. The base zone is named the base zone and not the leader zone because bases can never leave the base zone, and leaders can be deployed and will go to, for now, just the ground arena, maybe the space arena in the future. I really want that to happen. If a unit attacks a base, it does not enter the base zone. It'll stay in whatever arena it was in. Nothing ever enters the base zone other than bases and leaders. It's just a nice little storage spot for these 2 cards. Resource zone. Each player has their own resource zone. All cards in the resource zone are resources and can be exhausted to pay the cost of cards and abilities. Right now, there isn't anything that puts cards into the resource zone without saying playing it as a resource. So this will remain true, at least for now. So, yes, everything here is a resource. Resources are placed face down and exhausted. Players are allowed to look at their resources, and this is considered hidden information. As I was mentioning, players do not have to keep their resources in any particular order. What's the name of the card? There's something about lackeys. Enterprising Lackeys, I believe, is the name of the card. Yeah, Enterprising Lackeys says, when defeated, you may defeat a friendly resource. If you do, put this unit into play as a resource, and has Smuggle. So what this means is your opponent will know that it has become a resource and that it has Smuggle. If they're playing something like DJ, which allows them to steal one of your resources, they might want to know or keep track of which resource was the Enterprising Lackeys. However, when they play Enterprising Lackeys, you as a player do have the ability to rearrange your resources. Now, if you had all of your resources ready, you put Enterprising Lackeys into play exhausted, and it is the only resource that you have exhausted, and then your opponent plays DJ. While you're allowed to rearrange your resources, you're not allowed to rearrange which ones are exhausted and which ones are readied. And so your opponent would be able to target or choose the Enterprising Lackeys resource with a degree of accuracy. This is something that's going to be codified, or I've been told is going to be codified a little bit in an upcoming CR update. This isn't official, but it is the direction that the rules are going to be heading, and so I'm letting you folks know so that if it comes up, because rules aren't clear about it, you can rule with the highest degree of accuracy. Cards are only added to the resource zone during the resource step or when instructed to do so. You can't just be like, you know what, I really wish I had more resources, I want to play my Star Destroyer sooner, I'm just going to throw a bunch of cards into my resource pile and then play a 10-drop on turn 4. That is unfortunately, or I guess really fortunately, how the game works, because otherwise people will be playing a whole lot more Star Destroyers. Cards are also considered to have no attributes while they are a resource. This means that if you have a Commander Yularen in play who has you heal 1, then... Sorry, I keep on reading chat and getting distracted from my train of thought, and I need to get better at finishing my thought, then looking at chat. But yeah, if you have Commander Yularen and you play a green unit as a resource, it will not trigger Commander Yularen because it has no attributes. None of that information is revealed. Terramar99 asks, so once the resource has been raided again, we're in a 3-card Monty situation. Kind of, yeah. I have proposed that whenever a player interacts with their opponent's resources, it is a resource chosen at random. That way we don't have to deal with player shuffling or trying to keep track of what resources a player has. For example, if there are only 2 or 3 cards in a player's resource pile when you're playing something like DJ because you're teching it out real fast, and one of them is an Enterprising Lackeys, and you can keep track of it with 2 or 3 cards, that's not really a skill that the game wants to be testing so much. So currently, that's kind of how it is. You kind of have a 3-card Monty situation. I think ideally that's not how the game is, and that like keeping track of which resource is which as a face-down card is either something that is explicitly not a thing that players need to worry about because selection is random, or it is explicitly a thing that players both keep track of and have to provide as information. That latter one is a pain in the butt. If you have to be like, this is the resource I played on turn 1, this is the resource I played on turn 2, this is the one I played on turn 3, etc., etc. That's a pain in the butt. So I'm advocating for a little bit more randomness, but that is not currently the direction that we're headed in. We'll see what the rules update says when it comes out. This is just what I have from conversation with folks at FFG. Same goes for Super Laser Tech and Unrefusable Offer interaction. As it's hidden information, we cannot pull tech into game due to ability of bounty. Let me just pull up Unrefusable Offer. So this is different than knowing the identity or knowing which card is where. Once this is about how triggers are ordered, and if Super Laser Technician's ability triggers first, it will be in the resource and no longer can be found by Unrefusable Offer. If Unrefusable, J-Freak. Once it becomes a resource, it loses all attributes, so it cannot be played. I'm going to hang out here for a minute and see if there's any follow-up question on that. Other than that, moving on to the deck. Each player has their own deck. The deck is face down and out of play. You can only look at the contents of the deck if instructed to do so. This is usually through search the deck or search the top N cards of your deck instructions. The contents of the deck are hidden information. The number of cards in the deck is open information. And so your opponent doesn't get to know what cards you have, but they do get to know how many you have in case they're contemplating trying to mill you out and have you run out of cards in your deck. Cards remain in the deck until they are drawn, discarded, or played from the deck. If one of these events occurs, the card immediately leaves the deck and enters the appropriate zone. Moving on to the discard pile. Each player also has a discard pile. Events, defeated non-leader units, resources, upgrades, and discarded cards are all placed face up into the discard pile. It is also an unordered zone. That is to say, it doesn't matter what order the cards are in or how you organize them. You don't even have to have them as a single stack. The game rules do say you have them as a single stack, but if it's okay with your opponent, you can be like, hey, I'm going to be playing something like Rogue Squadron Skirmisher, or I have Kylo's TIE Silencers in here. I want to pull them off to the side during the phase that the TIE Silencer is discarded, or I just want to put all cards that cost 2 or less off to the side. So that I can just find that easily, because in a longer game, you'll have a stack of 10 or 15 cards in your discard pile, and going through that stack of 15 every single time you want to find a 2-drop will take a little bit of time. If you just have those set off to the side, still in the same general area as the rest of your discard pile, you can separate them just a little bit so that you can read or access that information pretty quickly. Okay. Alrighty, the hand. Each player has their own hand. Each player can look at their hand at any time. Like with the deck, the contents are hidden information, the quantity is open information. There's no limit to the number of cards in a player's hand. So if you have 10 units and they all die at once and you have a General Krell, congratulations, you have 10 cards in hand, and the only way they're leaving your hand is if an effect instructs you to discard them, or you play them, or turn them into resources, and that sort of thing. Cards also just simply, as mentioned, remain in hand until played or discarded. So going back to the Super Laser Technician and Unrefusable Offer. So, to be clear, there's either the when defeated resolves first, and there's no bounty. If the bounty resolves first, there's no resource. This is something that Tyler Parrott, who's one of the developers for the game, has talked about on Twitter. And so you can, You only get one or the other. You cannot get both. However, if you take control of the super laser tech with unrefusable offer, when it dies, you will get it as a resource rather than the player who owned it, because they don't control it at the time it's defeated. Let me just, for those of you who have Twitter, I'm going to throw that link in the chat. But this also has to do with the ordering of triggers. It's not just, this is not something that is not covered by the comprehensive rules. This is something that is complicated and covered by the comprehensive rules, and so Tyler here is simply clarifying. Moving on to the ground and space arena. Both players share the ground and space arena. All units in the ground arena are in the same arena. I see a typo there. I'll fix it after this presentation, but not right now. The layout is determined each game by the first unit played. If the first unit played is a ground unit, it's played to the left of your leader. That's going to be the ground arena for the rest of the game. I have seen in some cases where after a super laser blast, a player plays a unit on the other side. That's fine as long as both players are fine with it. If there are no units in play, it's okay to swap the arenas around. You just want to make sure that units are being played to the correct arena. Units can only attack enemy units in their arena or an enemy base, unless otherwise specified. Thank you, Gunship. Units can damage units in other arenas. So, Magda, the directing to Twitter is something, I'm going to go on a tangent here. So Magda Sindorai says, I know it's on Twitter, but it's really weird that in some cases I need to direct players to Twitter as a source of rules. As I was saying, this interaction in particular is covered by the comprehensive rules. It has to do with ordering triggers in section, 7.6. Whatever it is there. However, this is absolutely one of the more confusing things, and so this one is a clarification. However, there are also many rules that are not clear or not in the comprehensive rules, and they are covered currently only on Twitter or through communication with other folks. Currently on nexus.cascadegames.com/rules clarifications, we have a repository of those clarifications. These are approved to a degree by FFG. Like we are in communication with Fantasy Flight Games about getting these rules clarifications out and communicated to folks. The process for officially clarifying rules requires going through several steps of approvals, and it takes several weeks to a month to get something approved officially, which means that Tyler, who is an individual human who just is saying stuff for fun on his Twitter, is saying things that aren't necessary, that haven't gone through those chains of bureaucracy. One of the things that we're working on is making it so that Nexus is a repository of that information. For now, we're currently linking to Tyler's explanations on Twitter. When I have more free time, I'm going to sit down and pull out the explanations from the comprehensive rules to answer these frequently asked questions. And if it's not covered in the comprehensive rules, reach out to Ryan Sereno, the rules admiral for Star Wars Unlimited, and be like, hey, so this clarification has been made. It's not in the comprehensive rules. Can you put it in the comprehensive rules, or can you give me the explanation that I can give to players to point out where it exists in the comprehensive rules? JFreak7, yeah, the GitHub with the list is currently what we're mirroring on the website. We're going to go into a little bit more detail and expand and refine it over time. One of the challenges with the GitHub list and linking to Twitter is that if you don't have a Twitter account, which many people do not, you can only see the post that is linked, and so sometimes you'll get an answer, but it won't mention any of the cards, and you don't have access to the question, so it's a suboptimal resource. It's what we have for now. It's something that Cascade Games is working on fixing. In the long term, FFG would like everything to be in the comprehensive rules, but it takes a while to go through the documentation and approvals process, and so Twitter and the Cascade Game website are both going to be a couple different stopgaps. The Cascade Games website is currently being updated relatively close to live. When clarifications are made, they make their way onto the website pretty quickly, so you can use that as a resource rather than Twitter, which some people might like, because going through Twitter is a bit of a headache. The GitHub is, again, the same list for now. But back to Ground and Space Arena. As mentioned, it is a shared arena, so playing something like Bombing Run, which does something to each unit in that arena, will affect both your units and enemy units. Effects can also have cards interact across arenas, unless it specifies. Admiral Akbar lets you deal damage to ground units equal to the number of ground units you control, or deal damage to a space unit equal to the number of space units control. Akbar is a brilliant strategist, and it doesn't matter what arena he's fighting in, he's effective in both. Something like Strike True lets a unit on the ground deal damage to a unit in the sky, or the other way around. Alrighty. In play and out of play. So, the Ground Arena, Space Arena, Base, and Resource Zones are all in play. Cards in these zones can affect the game state and be chosen for abilities. Hand, deck, and discard are all out of play, and generally don't affect the game state and can't be chosen for abilities. So, for example, with Waylay, you cannot return a unit in your discard pile to your hand. Cards only affect things are in play. Discard does not count as in play. And so without the additional clarification, you can't waylay a card from your discard pile. If it said return a non-linear unit or a non-linear unit in your discard pile to its owner's hand, then you'd be able to pull something out of your discard pile. Similarly, as soon as a card leaves play, like General Dodonna, its effect stops applying. So if General Dodonna goes from in play, being in the ground arena, to being in your discard pile, its ability stops to apply. And then, in addition to in play and out of play, there is set aside, which is that area that we were talking about earlier, which is not part of the game at all. Nothing interacts with it. There are no the game rules don't really interact with set aside, other than pulling tokens from set aside. But those tokens can be anything. They can be Tootsie Rolls, they can be M&Ms, they can be whatever you want as long as it's clear to you and your opponent. Blue M&Ms for shield tokens is great because then you can eat them when they're destroyed, and it makes thematic sense because they're... I don't know, I just am hungry right now and I want to talk about M&Ms for a second. Anything can be used as a token, they're set aside. It's not a part of the game, generally speaking. Alrighty, moving on to round structure. So, to set up the game, you put bases and leaders into play. Where does the sideboard reside in terms of rules? I don't believe the sideboard is actually referenced in the comprehensive rules. Let me double check that real quick. Let me flip through my hard copy of the rules that I've printed out, because I'm that kind of human being. Yep. Comprehensive rules. So Magnus and Dore, where does the sideboard reside in terms of rules? It doesn't exist in the comprehensive rules. It exists only in tournament regulations. And so it is set aside, or not. It is not a part of the game, and it's not something that anything in the game references. At some point in the future, it might be, but for now, sideboards don't exist according to the comprehensive rules. This is one of the things where tournament regulations and comprehensive rules have weird conflicts, and generally you're going to follow the tournament regulations at tournaments and ignore them when you're not playing in a tournament. If you're playing at home, sideboards don't exist because you're not playing a formalized best of three. After a game, if you're like, hey, I want to try out some different cards and see how I do against your deck, can I swap some cards out? You can do that. There's no formal sideboard. Every card you own is a card that you can swap in if you're not playing as though you're playing in a tournament match. So for the rules themselves, which don't include tournament structure, sideboards don't exist. Um, so to start the game, you put your bases and leaders into play. You randomly determine which player goes first. You technically randomly determine which player chooses who goes first. I am struggling to see a reason why you would ever choose to go second, because if you wanted to go second, you could just start with the initiative and then just say pass and see what your opponent does. But if you win the die roll or whatever random method you use to determine who's choosing who goes first, you can choose to go second or not start with the initiative. What you cannot do is randomly determine the outcome of the game. So when the game ends, you can't roll a die or do whatever it is you did to determine who starts with initiative, but rather you cannot do that to determine who wins the game overall. That brings us too close to gambling and puts us at risk, or puts the game at risk of being strictly limited due to that consideration. You draw an opening hand of 6 cards. You can take 1 mulligan, wherein you shuffle the entire hand back and draw 6 new cards. You must keep the second hand if you choose to mulligan, and the active player must make their mulligan decision first. If both players want information about what the other player is doing, the active player, or the player who has the initiative, has to make their decision about whether or not to mulligan first, and they communicate that. If the active player is considering whether or not to take a mulligan, and their opponent immediately looks at their hand and is like, this is unplayable garbage, and throws it back into their deck and starts shuffling, the active player is not locked into keeping because there hasn't been any communication from their part. This isn't something that is formalized in the documentation, but players can't rush other players through steps of the game without communication. Similarly, and we'll get to this in the regroup phase, the steps are draw 2 cards, resource up to 1 card, and then ready all of your things. And these are distinct steps. They're not happening simultaneously. But as a player, you cannot draw your 2 cards, immediately resource a card, and then ready your units and resources and say, aha, I've already readied, therefore we're in the ready step. You're not allowed to draw cards or play a resource. That is not how the game works. You're not allowed to rush your opponent through things or move through shared steps of the game. You cannot preempt your opponent to lock them into decisions. If there's communication, that's a different story. But if there's no communication, you can't lock your opponent into decisions. Final part of game setup is resourcing 2 cards. You have to resource 2 cards. You cannot choose to resource 1, 0, and you, of course, cannot resource more than 2. The action phase has 3 steps. There's the start of phase and end of phase, and then the player turns. With every start of phase and every end of phase, several things can happen in a particular sequence. The first thing that happens is lasting effect end. A lasting effect is an effect that has a duration. So for this round, there's a card that I can't remember off the top of my head. I think there's only one that says for this round. We're going to look it up real quick. Yes. No good to me dead says exhausted unit. That unit can't ready this round. That effect expires first thing at the start of phase of the action phase of the next turn. Then delayed effects occur. Delayed effects are part of an ability, including triggers or action abilities, pretty much anything that occurs, an event ability that instructs the player to do something at a later point in time. Han Solo Audacious Smuggler, at the start of the next action phase, defeat a resource you control, is a delayed effect. It's an effect that was set up beforehand and occurs now. So we have the lasting effects end, so no good to me dead ceases to apply. Then our delayed effects, Han Solo defeating a resource, and then finally triggered abilities occur. which includes something like Grand Admiral Thrawn, when the action phase starts. Lucy Dono says, or X troops gain +1/+1 for a phase. Yes. For this, I was looking in particular for something that ended at the start of a round. A lot of things apply only to a phase. And so, yeah, there are a lot of effects that last until the end of phase. And then you have your delayed effects and then your triggered abilities. Chirrut is another one that lasts until the end of the phase. There are very, very few that delay or lasting effects that expire at the start of a round. Most of them end at the end of a round. Wolfstrider asks, what would happen if my opponent wins the die roll to go first and openly says, let me see what I draw before I pick if I want to go first, then draws their hand and says they want a mulligan, still not saying if they're going first or second? I don't believe that this is covered explicitly in the game rules, and so this is somewhere where we rely on philosophy. If it is in the game rules, somebody please correct me. I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but if somebody knows that it's mentioned either in game rules or in turn policy, please let me know. Otherwise, a player... So you're not allowed to rush your opponent through making decisions, but a player can rush themselves through their own decisions. Since most players, most of the time, would choose to go first, my philosophy here, the way I think about it is, the default is the player who wins the die roll or random method goes first. And by drawing their hand, they are accepting the shortcut of, I'm going first. So I would... If I was called to a table in that situation, I'd be like, hey, you have to declare if you're going first or second. Most players who win the die roll go first, and so that's the default that we hold folks to. There is no formalized system of shortcuts or anything like that, but this is something that could fit into those should those be developed. If you're a player, this happens, just be like, hey, you have to let them know that they have to decide before they see their hand. And just be like, I think you should just go first. If they're like, I mean, I'm not comfortable with that, I want to decide after I see my hand, just call for a judge. The judge will point out, hey, you do have to decide before you draw your opening hand. You've drawn your opening hand. There isn't a default. We're going to have to make a decision here. And I think that defaulting to the most common situation where the player will go first anyways is the best way to do it. Out of curiosity, chat, how many of you have chosen, like, won a die roll and chosen to go second in a game? Have you even considered wanting to go second while playing a game of Star Wars Unlimited? I'm really curious to see if anybody has considered this. Okay. Bosk wants to go second sometimes. Oh, that's fair. Like, just throwing a bounty on their first play. Cad goes second sometimes. Awesome. That's actually really good to know. I don't know what the ratio is, but I think generally there should be a default, and this is something that I'll bring up with FFG and be like, hey, sometimes players will shortcut through things. There should be a default for this. Yeah, no. Bosk and Cad Bane, with the ability to interact with your opponent's first play, it's super valuable to go second sometimes. And if they don't do anything terribly exciting, you can claim the initiative, or you can play a unit yourself. So yeah, that makes a ton of sense, actually. Alrighty, moving on. Action phase. Once both players pass, the end of phase begins. Lasting effects end first. If there are multiple lasting effects, they end simultaneously. So, for example, if a unit is getting -2/-2 from Make an Opening and +4/+4 from Moment of Glory, they both expire at the same time rather than one after the other. And so, if it would survive with neither of those effects on it, there's never a point where it only has Make an Openings -2/-2 applying to it. I'm really glad y'all engaged on that question about going first and second. That's actually really helpful for me. I'm usually playing more aggressive and proactive decks, and so I'm like, yeah, I will always go first. And the way that Bosk and Cad Bane and Jabba with his tricks interact differently is a really good way to think about it. Alright, regroup phase. Well, we have the start of phase and the end of phase, and we have lasting effects, delayed effects, and triggered abilities. Those are straightforward. We've talked those to death. We don't need to go over them again. We have the draw step. Each player draws 2 cards. They draw these cards simultaneously, both to the other card and to the other player. Players take 3 damage if they try to draw a card from an empty deck. This means that if I'm at 6 life and have an empty deck, and my opponent, or 6 remaining health on my base, and my opponent has 1 remaining health on their base, then we both draw 2 cards, we both take 6 damage, and we're defeated simultaneously. J-Freak, you're saying that in tournament regulations it's random, it doesn't state a player's chosen at random, they decide what they want. I believe you, because I remember there being a discrepancy between tournament regulations and the comprehensive rules. Regarding initiative, let's see. There was an update with Set 2. It currently reads, at the beginning of the first game of a best-of-3 match, randomly determine a player. That player chooses who starts with the initiative. For each game after that, the player who lost the previous game chooses who starts with the initiative. So it is still a choice. Oh, Quick Start just says you roll a die and you randomly determine who goes first. Yeah, that makes sense. The Quick Start rules I could also see making that shortcut, and in that discrepancy, the CR overrides the Quick Start rules. J-Freak, I'm interested to know what version you're looking at. The one I'm looking at was last updated July 12th. If there's changes, it'd be good to know that they exist. But yeah, there's having a discrepancy between the Quick Start rules and the comprehensive rules makes a lot of sense. This distinction isn't something that's going to come up a lot. The comprehensive rules by the Golden Rules themselves say that the Quick Start rules are overruled by the comprehensive rules. Going back to the regroup phase, as we look at this documentation chat, after you draw, each player resources up to 1 card from their hand. Like with the start of game procedure and mulligans, believe the active player is the player who has to make the decision first. I'm just going to double check that with my comprehensive rules in front of me, because I want to make sure that I'm telling you the truth. Yep, starting with the active player, each player may choose to resource 1 card from their hand. So again, this is a situation where the opponent cannot rush a player through this decision-making process. Finally, we have the ready step. Each player readies all resources and units they control. This is, again, a simultaneous thing. All of it happens all at the same time. And that's our show. Yep. The old versions can get you sometimes. So I'm going to hang out here for a couple seconds. If any folks have any other questions, there are several edits that I need to make to that presentation because there are typos here, there, and everywhere in between. And I want to make sure that they go away because we don't like having typos in our lessons. Other than that, I'm just going to hang out for a minute. If folks have questions or want to discuss anything a little bit more, feel free to toss it in the chat and I'll take a look at it. Sure. J-Freak asks, can I discuss scanning officer and shuffling rearranging resources? So there was a big discussion in the Discord about it. I have not read that Discord. I don't know what's being said there. What I know is from the devs, we don't want players to have to constantly keep track of all of the resources. We don't want them to have to keep track of, like, which resource was played when. That is a huge mental load that the designers of the game don't want to put onto the players. And so players are allowed to rearrange their resources. However, what you cannot do is ready one resource and exhaust another one. So the ones that are ready have to stay ready. The ones that are exhausted have to stay exhausted. Those are the restrictions. So if you play Scanning Officer, I can rearrange my resources as long as the ready ones stay ready and the exhausted ones stay exhausted. That is what I've heard from the developers in conversation with them. That's the direction that they want to go with that. It's not formalized in the rules yet because getting that language precise will take some time. And it's in a weird place with regards to communication because it doesn't exist in the rules yet, and it's something people are doing, and it's making people min-max. About after resources are chosen. Let me pull up Scanning Officer real quick. Oh, so once the cards are revealed, yes, you're absolutely able to shuffle your resources. So they can see, like, if they play one Scanning Officer and pick cards A, B, and C, after they're revealed and the ability resolves, you can shuffle your resources afterwards. Like, you get the opportunity to, your opponent plays Scanning Officer, you're allowed to randomize. Then, at some point, Scanning Officer's ability resolves. After it resolves, you're allowed to randomize again. That is my understanding of how the devs want Scanning Officer, that sort of thing, to play out. Gentle Giant asks, why was my video flipped for the AMA yesterday? For the broadcast where I'm just doing these, I'm talking directly to the webcam. For the AMA, I had it in a Google Meet, and Google Meet automatically mirrors your webcam so you don't look weird to yourself. Wolfstrider says, I think it's funny and sad when someone has tech and I play Scanning Officer, buy 3 ready resources. Yeah. Octurnal, but can't shuffle after they've been chosen, but before they're revealed. Yeah. Once we start resolving the ability, we're going to do the whole thing. And then it goes back to when you can randomize it a little bit. Jfreak asks, let's say I play Scanning Officer and I know his smuggle card's on the left. How should I handle the situation knowing it will benefit me if they don't shuffle? You're not required to tell your opponent that they're allowed to randomize. It's similar to if you play Viper Probe Droid on your opponent's hand and you get to see the order of their hand and then they just put their hand back and they don't shuffle it at all. You are allowed to keep track of that knowledge. So you can say, Scanning Officer, can I resolve the ability? They say, yeah, go ahead, resolve the ability. Of course you can. What are you talking about? There's nothing that I can do. This isn't magic. I don't have counterspell. And then you're like, okay, great. I'm going to grab those 3 cards on the left. And they're like, how did you know that they were smuggle cards? At that point, I would be like, you keep your smuggle cards on the left, and you're allowed to randomize them. But, like, you don't have to proactively let them know that they're allowed to randomize it. This is an option like with randomizing the contents of your hand or reordering the contents of your hand. On the draw games. So you know that the test has already been given for planetary qualifiers. That's a good call out. The Season 0 application closes in just over 6 hours, so if you haven't filled it out and are interested in judging a planetary qualifier, I recommend that you do so. Will there be a formal email saying you haven't been chosen for the qualifiers due to not getting sufficient answers correct in the test, or a separate email at the store saying the store selected other candidates? Right now we have between 700 and 800 applicants. The way this process is going to work is we're going to go to each store and say, these are recommended head judges. These are our recommended floor judges. And we're going to over-recommend to each store. We're going to try and recommend 2 to 3 potential head judges for each store. So if there's somebody that they've worked with before and had a good relationship with or negative relationship with, they have some flexibility there. Similarly, we're going to try and recommend 5 to 10 floor judges when hopefully ideally the events are using slightly smaller staffs. And we're not going to be informed of who is not selected. The way this evaluation works is that there is not a passing score. If you get every question wrong, we're not going to select you. I can tell you that much. But we're going to be grading on a curve, effectively, and we're going to be taking into account practical experience. If one person has no sort of event or leadership experience at all, but got one more question right than somebody who has been running a local soccer league or local football league for 10 years, I'm going to probably be like, hey, you understand the rules a little bit less than this other person, but you have a lot of leadership experience, so I think you're a better fit. And so there is no passing grade. There will be some documentation, ideally going out tomorrow, but I'm on a bit of a time crunch, and so it might have to be Friday or early next week, that goes over the evaluation in a whole and talks about each of the answers so that you're able to compare what we're saying with the answers that you put down. Magic Player for Life. If you go to nexus.cascadegames/season 0, there are also some links just on nexus.cascadegames for season 0. You can find all the information you need there on the Nexus. J-Freak, going back to the skating officer question, they call a judge and say, I wasn't given an opportunity to randomize. So what I would say is you should not touch your opponent's cards without their permission, ever. And so if you're like, hey, I'm ready to resolve scanning officer, I want these 3 cards. And they're like, before you choose, I would like to randomize. They can do that. Because again, this is their first opportunity to be like, hold on, you're doing a thing, I want this opportunity. So you should not just scanning officer and then immediately flip over 3 cards. It's polite to just be like, hey, I want to resolve scanning officer. Is it okay to touch my card? To touch your cards? And if they're like, yeah, go ahead and reveal cards, you reach over and flip them over. And at that point, they're like, I wasn't given a chance to randomize. You're like, I asked if I could touch their cards and reveal cards, and they said I could go ahead. I think we're way past the point of randomization. Commander KCQ, you thought about filling out the form to be a judge for the planetary qualifier near you, but wanted to play it instead. Would it be better, though, to at least sign up so I can let them know that I'm interested in judging in the future? You can fill it out and just say that you're not interested in judging to get that experience. But if you're not interested in judging an event, we're not going to pass that information along to any tournament organizers. So if all you want to do is get your name in the ring for future events, that is not one of the goals of this project. And so that doesn't help a lot. Thanks for throwing the links into the chat. That's something that I could have done. That would have been really handy for me. Trashy Panda. So if they say I choose these 3 cards and I know they will miss, I just say sounds good. But if I know they will hit, now I say I'd like to randomize. So this is one of the weird things about communication and resolving things. They should, I want to avoid the community from devolving into a bunch of rules lawyers and sticklers who are trying to get every centimeter possible out of their opponent. There's a lot of ways that you can communicate and angle shoot and gain an advantage. This is something that you can absolutely do. We currently don't have robust communication policy. This is something that I've talked with Fantasy Flight about having policy about how things can resolve, how you communicate things, what sort of information locks you into decisions, What sort of information are you allowed to just be like, I played a card, no wait, I didn't want to play that card. Are you allowed to take stuff back? All that stuff. So for the example that you're giving, I don't have an answer because there isn't an answer in policy, and this isn't a call that I've taken before. What I would probably do is ask how y'all have resolved scanning officer before, and if every other time you've just been like, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, and then when they pick ones that you know will be hits, you're like, I'm going to want to randomize instead. You're moving too fast. I'm going to have some questions for you. And there's a line between officially unsporting behavior that is worthy of a penalty and behavior that will make every player in the store look at you and be like, is this how we're playing? Okay, I guess. There's a concept from other trading card games, particularly Magic. And I want to be clear that I'm not talking about you in particular. I'm talking about archetypes of players very generally. But there's something called the Levine Trench, named after the judge who started talking about this principle, which is a graph of player skill versus player kindness. And at one end of the graph, you have players who are brand new, and they're super kind. They're just happy to play. They're having a ball. And then as players get more and more competitive, they become less fun to play against. The players who are always like, they always come in second at their store showdown, so they never get the champion card. Or they always just barely miss on top 8 of the planetary qualifier. The folks who primary goal is winning and who struggle to pull that out can get really frustrated. At the start of this graph, you have people who are just excited to play. Then you have people who are winning but are not. And then at the other end, you have the nicest players ever who are some of the best players in the game and the most competitive players who are winning stuff like galactic championships, regional championships. And that's because they have a 65 or 70% win rate because they're so good at the game. It doesn't matter if they don't chase these angles. Stuff like randomizing scanning officer, and like randomizing scanning officer only if they're going to hit. The amount of percentage points that gains you in win rate is, I think, much lower than players are accurately estimating. A lot of players try and angle shoot, and there are other ways to improve your skill generally. This is something that I'm talking about with years of experience from Magic, where players are like, okay, if I do this subtle mind game, I win 0.01% more games. Like, this will win me 1 in 100 games or 1 in 1,000 games, and that's worth it. But a lot of the top players don't do that because their strategic and tactical knowledge and game knowledge is just at a level where that doesn't actually matter to them. Let's see. Yep, I'm just reading a lot of questions. Wolf Strider. So, if you are aware of something that is not legally happening correctly, you have to inform your opponent. So with Maul and Overwhelm, Overwhelm is different from Trample in Magic or in other similar games in that it is mandatory. You don't get to choose, you don't get to assign damage to unit and then maybe assign damage to the player. Overwhelm will always occur. And so if you're attacked by a unit with Overwhelm and your opponent doesn't indicate damage to your base, that's something that you want to point out. Yes, Gentle Giant. The situations like that and many others are reasons to see better communication policy. It's something that we've talked to them about here at Cascade Games. I'm like, hey, these are some issues that communication policy can help with. It just takes a while to... It's very easy for me to explain using English and spending 10 minutes talking about something to explain it to a group of 10 people who I'm able to have back and forth with. It is so much harder to write it in 50 words so that an international audience who has to understand your meaning in just those 50 words gets it, because this is an extraordinarily complex topic. Communication policy, really all policy, everything governing how players interact with each other, everything outside of the mechanics of the game, it's impossible to predict how players will act. With the mechanical interaction between Super Laser Technician and Unrefusable Offer, there is a very finite number of ways that that can play out. There's, in fact, 2 ways that that can play out, and we can post that on Twitter and everybody gets it. Twitter's not the best delivery method, but we can just be like, there's an answer, this is the answer, period. With an interaction between 2 people, there's an infinite number of issues that can arise. And so it's impossible to write policy that covers everything. And so something that's important and something that they're working on is philosophy of, when our written words don't cover this, this is the goal that you should be striving for. And the goal is everybody is having fun and the most legal game is occurring. And one of the things that they're going to be adding is something called reciprocal penalties. So if you make an error and I don't call attention to it, one, that's going to be, like, if I'm aware of it and it's an advantage for me. So if you attack me with something with Overwhelm, I notice that you don't mark the damage on it, I don't take the damage, and then the next turn you're like, oh wait, there should have been Overwhelm damage. And I'm like, oh, well, you missed it. And we call a judge. They're like, did you know about this? I'm like, yes, I did know about it. Then I get disqualified for cheating. Hiding something that you knew was wrong and gaining advantage from it is the same as doing something wrong and hiding it. Communication gets a little bit iffy because understanding intent gets really hard, and these sorts of investigations are something that I'll talk about. I want to get through the rules first before we get into this philosophy stuff. But yeah. And let's see. Nilrem asks, what about at a table next to another game? You see they forgot Sentinel. Do you interrupt their play and point it out? What I would do is just be like, yeah, I would absolutely just raise my hand and call for a judge. And current policy states that spectators are not supposed to interfere with other games. And generally, if you're looking at a game and call a judge, the players at that table will look at you, then look at the game and be like, oh crap, we forgot about Sentinel. And then they stop their game. So even without talking to them directly, you can interrupt a game. It's important to note that one of the things that we caution you, like, if you're going to say something to the players, be like, I think I saw something go wrong. Don't say more than that. Yeah, J Freak points out they could have played Spec Force and you missed it. They're like, if somebody pays the incorrect number of resources for something, it might be because there's a cost reduction or cost increase in the game. Similarly, some things players are allowed to miss. Currently, the only thing a player is allowed to miss are may abilities that explicitly say you may, and a player can miss those. Everything else, including triggered abilities or abilities that say your opponent may, so bounties, those cannot be willfully forgotten. You cannot just be like, I don't want to do that. But calling attention to a missed you may trigger, which is something that is legal to occur, might remind a player about this, and it's not your responsibility as a spectator to call attention to something that can be legally missed. It's a complicated and hairy subject. It falls into policy. Policy is going to be improved. I know that they are working on trying to have really solidly refined policy for the first wave of planetary qualifiers. I think their goal is to have new documents before October rather than before the launch of Set 3. I don't know if they're going to... I think that's their goal. They haven't said explicitly that, and it's definitely not a promise or guarantee in any way, shape, or form. And they absolutely do want to continue to update and refine policy, but as was mentioned, policy is hard to write and needs to be updated. Policy is where we use our judgment. That is where the term judge really comes from. Like, answering rules questions is that is what a lot of players see judging as, is just knowing the comprehensive rules. But as you get into judging, you're going to learn all of the rules, you're going to learn all the interactions. You'll be like, yes, the answer is this because it says so in section 5.4.3. And you're like, okay, cool, that's the answer. Whereas there will always be a situation where a player's like, okay, so my opponent said this, so I did this, but it turns out what they meant was this other thing because English isn't their first language, and now we have this whole situation. You're like, cool. I have to figure out, the policy documents don't have a section on what to do when players are speaking in their second language and shift tense by accident. That's not something that the policy documents are going to cover, because then they would have to cover all human interaction, and it's mentioned infinite. So policy is where we use our judgment. One of the big things that they're working on that may take longer is philosophy. The ideas and thoughts behind the decisions that they're making, so that when the exact policy and instructions they give you don't fit the situation, you're able to make a judgment call that is consistent with what other judges would make in a similar situation. With that rambling mess out of the way, I'm just going to hang out for like another 30 seconds or a minute unless I see any other questions. But other than that, thank you all for joining me. We'll be back on Friday, same time, same place, for lesson number 6, the 6th and final Judge Apprentice lesson. Also releasing that day is the Judge Apprentice exam. That is currently going to be taking the form of a Google form. We don't currently have the tools to have it built up on site, so grading will occur manually. It'll take a little bit of time because I'm not going to be able to work that much over the weekend. But yeah, that first exam will be available on Friday, and ideally Friday evening before the broadcast, I'll be able to approve some exams, and we'll have some certified Judge Apprentices on Friday. J-Freak, you have 7th pick in your fantasy football draft. Gosh, okay, this is way off topic. I'm technically in a fantasy football league. I am very far from an expert. I don't know how deep he's going to go, but I'm going to recommend... what's his name? Pika Nassau, I think. I can't pronounce his name for the life of me, but he did wonders for me last year. So just draft him first. On the draw games, will any of the streams be archived in the future? I am currently in the... Puka, yes, thank you. I'm currently in the process of putting all of the streams onto YouTube. And so if you go to the SWU Judges YouTube, you'll be able to find that information. So all of the broadcasts and all of the lessons will be available on YouTube. This one I'll probably be able to upload it later tonight or tomorrow. I don't know. I think everything else is either uploaded and not yet public, or uploaded and currently public. Eventually, I'm going to make sure that they're linked on the lesson pages and they're accessible everywhere. Anyways, that's all. Thank you so much. Good luck with your fantasy football drafts, and I'll see you all on Friday.